Want to try out SQL Server but don't know where to begin? Let's get you sorted. Welcome to this video on installing SQL Server. My name is Kevin Fiesel and I'm the proprietor of Galaxy Services LLC, a consulting firm which specializes in work all across the data platform space, especially SQL Server. In this video, we will show how to install SQL Server on a machine running Windows. You'll get a walkthrough of the installation process as well as some tips and tricks to make administering this server easier in the future. Now before we jump in, let's do some level setting. SQL Server is a relational database management system owned by Microsoft. The website DB Engines rates SQL Server as the third most popular database technology. This guy rates it as the best, but I might be a little biased. Every few years, Microsoft releases a new edition of SQL Server. As of the time of this video, SQL Server 2022 is the latest version, and it's the one we'll work through, though much of what we see will apply to all currently supported versions. Now, let's talk about the next key thing, editions of SQL Server. SQL Server comes in two major editions, Enterprise and Standard. This video isn't about licensing, so we won't get too far into the weeds there. But the short version is that Standard Edition lets you do most of what Enterprise can, but at a lower cost. Enterprise Edition makes the job of administering larger databases easier, letting you use more RAM than Standard Edition allows, as well as enabling some advanced functionality. Now, I love companies using Standard Edition, though there's a reason they also call it Expensive Edition. Now you might be saying to the screen, hey Kevin, I'm not made of money here. How do I try out SQL Server while keeping both of my kidneys? Well, good news for you. I mean, not about your kidneys. You lost one of them after that one time you woke up in a bathtub full of ice. But when it comes to SQL Server, there are two editions which are free of charge. The first is Express Edition, which you can run in production for free. Now it's really limited in capabilities, but if you just need a relational database and don't have too much data, it can do the job. The other is Developer Edition, which gives you all the functionality of Enterprise Edition with none of the cost. Of course, you can't use it in production, but you can certainly install it to learn more about the product, and that's the edition we're going to install today. Now that we've landed on a version and edition, let's get started by grabbing the SQL Server installation media. Because we're just installing Developer Edition on a PC, I can do a quick search for the installer and download it. If you already have a license for Standard or Enterprise Edition, you probably have a better place to get your media, like the Microsoft Volume Licensing website. But I don't have anything that fancy. What I do have, however, is plenty of time to wait. Yeah, that installer is only 4 megabytes, but the next step is for it to grab the SQL Server installation media, which is a much heftier download. Once you have this, you can keep it around, and if you need to reinstall SQL Server, you can do it. You can also make a copy of it in just 823,040 floppy disks. And that joke just lost anyone born after 2005. Oh well. So we got our installer. Let's get installing. Step 1 in our demo, we are going to go to Microsoft's website to try out SQL Server. You can do a quick Google search for SQL Server 2022 Developer Edition and you'll be able to get to this website. If you scroll down just a little bit on the page, there's a download now for Developer Edition. We're going to do that, and the download itself is very fast, only about 4 megabytes. Okay, now that we have the download completed, we're going to get our installation media. See, the download itself was 4 megs, but we need to get some separate media, and this separate media will take a while. We're going to let this go through the power of editing and zoom right through to the end here. And that's it. It's a lot faster when you have an editor do that for you. So the next step is, we have our download media. This is an ISO format, meaning that I could burn this to a DVD or do something like that, but Windows comes with ISO readers built in. So if I double click on the file, then I'll be able to see the setup folder. I'm going to select the setup application, and that'll take me to the SQL Server setup page. Now this installation center has a lot of pieces to it, and you're welcome to try it out, try out a lot of different things. In installation, the first item is a new SQL Server installation. That's the thing that we're going to care about today. But there are other things that you may want to install and try out, like Reporting Services or Management Studio. If you need to repair an installation, that's where maintenance helps. There are some tools to help you with the installation process, as well as additional resources that you can try out on your own, like getting books online. The last tab is some advanced scenarios, additional things that we're not going to cover in today's installation video. So let's go back to installation and choose a new SQL Server installation. This is going to bring up a wizard that we could click next on and get SQL Server, but we're not going to do that because we're professionals here. So at this point, I can select a particular edition of SQL Server, and we see three separate options. One is to specify a free edition, one is to pay as you go through Microsoft Azure licensing, and the third one is if you have a product key, you can enter it there. If I select the drop-down, we can see Evaluation, Developer, and Express Editions. So Developer Edition is the one we're going to want. Express Edition lets you run in production, but it's a very limited version of SQL Server. Evaluation Edition lets you run in production for a limited amount of time to try out a new version of SQL Server. And it will be Enterprise Edition as far as functionality goes. So I've got my edition, let's select Next. And agree to terms, we're not gonna sue Microsoft. Next. We have an option to use Windows Update to grab SQL Server updates as they come down. So this can automatically install cumulative updates and GDRs in the event of, say, a security problem. This is something that I would recommend if you're not going to be very active in your installation process. So if you are a DBA, you're doing this for real, you're doing this for a bunch of servers, probably don't need to do that because you're going to have a process by which you install new SQL Server cumulative updates. But if you're just somebody who's running a SQL Server and you want to try to keep it up to date with as little effort as possible, this will do it for you. There is a warning for Windows Firewall. That warning essentially says, hey, your Windows Firewall is on. Make sure that the firewall settings are correct. So we can skip past that. The next option here is new in 2022. This is integration with Azure Arc. So this will allow us to feed in some metrics from our SQL Server into Azure for the purposes of, say, billing or for consistent administration. This is not a bit of functionality that's required for a SQL Server installation, and I'm going to uncheck it. We're not going to do that on this installation of SQL Server. So what I want to do now is choose what functionality gets installed as part of my SQL Server installation here. I do need the database engine. That's going to be required. The database engine is the core functionality of SQL Server. The other checkboxes below it are additional functionality that may be useful. Replication allows you to send data over to other instances of SQL Server or to other databases. Machine learning services allows you to run R and Python code as well as Java code in SQL Server itself. The next option is to use full text indexing, and that's a way of being able to analyze text and search for keywords or key phrases within text in a much more reasonable manner than what SQL Server has by default. There are no regular expressions in SQL Server, so full text indexing is the best approach if you have a constant need for a lot of very advanced text searches. Data quality services, something I'm going to leave unchecked here, and Polybase, I love it. We're also not going to check it for this installation. Because this is just talking about the database engine, I'm not going to spend any time on the rest of these. So we're just going to select the database engine and move on from there. My next step is to name an instance. I can choose the default instance, which is MS SQL Server, or give it a name, and I'm just going to choose the default. After that, I need to set some users. By default, SQL Server creates phony accounts. They're pseudo accounts that start with NT service. And this is just going to give the rights to the appropriate SQL Server service that is necessary, nothing more. I recommend using either these virtual accounts, or if you have an Active Directory service account that you want to use in a domain, you can use that as well. But if you don't have that, the virtual accounts are fine. The next tab I want to look at is collation. By default, SQL Server's collation uses a SQL collation. It's okay, but it's not great. I actually recommend that you change this to a Windows collation. And there are some advantages to using Windows collations around string search and the like. If we scroll through here, we can see that there's a wide variety of Windows collations that are included in SQL Server. We're going to land on using the Latin 1 collation, which will cover all of the characters in the English language and will serve us well for our purposes. For the next step, we get to decide, do we want to have SQL authentication? Generally, I say yes. You want to have SQL authentication. Your environment may require that you turn that off, but I like having this as a fallback option in the event that there's a problem with Windows authentication. Now, I also want to add appropriate administrators, which for me is just myself because this is a virtual machine and I'm the only user on it. But this is where you could add those Windows group. There are some directories for where we're going to put data files, the database files, the log files, as well as backups. So you can choose that, and I recommend putting those on different drives. The tempdb settings are configurable at the time of installation. I do recommend setting tempdb to something that is reasonable for your environment. For my test server, yeah, it's fine to have tempdb that's just a few megabytes. But for a prod server, I might pre-allocate that to several gigs. So the next step is max degree of parallelism. This essentially says I have however many cores, CPU cores available. How many will I allow a single query to run? And you can set this to the default of 0, which is use all the cores. You can cap it at another number. For a transactional processing system, I like to keep that number in the 2 to 6 range. For an analytical system, usually I'll do 8 to 16. For purposes of this demo box, I'm going to leave it at 4. And then for memory, there's a certain amount of memory available. The default in SQL Server is essentially 2 terabytes of memory, and that's probably going to be a little bit too much because I don't have 2 terabytes of memory on this VM. What happens is that SQL Server, if you don't set a maximum amount of memory, is going to continue being greedy and grabbing as much memory as it can. Now, if there's memory pressure, it will release some of that memory as needed, but it's going to try to get as much as possible. We want to cap it at a reasonable amount to allow the operating system to maintain a certain amount of RAM, to allow other applications that may be running to have enough RAM that they're not going to cause failure or cause slowdown on our SQL Server. There is a recommendation that the installer can set for you here. So we can take that or we can modify it. I'm going to take it, and to do so I have to check a box. And finally, file stream. File stream isn't really that commonly used, so I'm going to leave it unchecked here. If you really want a video on file stream, hit me up in the comments, let me know. At this point, we're ready for installation. But one thing that's really cool is there's a configuration file that gets created as a result of going through the wizard. And I can go to this directory and it'll show me the config file. If I open up that config file, we can see all of the items that we've selected and work with it on another machine. So if I want to automate this installation on 500 machines, I can use a config file and do that. Now that I've hit next, it's time to install. The installation process at this point is just kick back and wait for it to finish. So let's zoom ahead a little bit until things are finished and we'll pick it up from there. All right, thanks again to the power of editing, we have flown ahead to our destination and we can see that everything installed successfully. Let's hit close and connect to our instance. In order to connect to an instance, we're going to need some sort of software. The software that I'm going to try out for the purposes of today's demo is Azure Data Studio, which is a freely available solution for connecting to SQL Server, connecting to Postgres, and working with those database engines. There is another tool, SQL Server Management Studio, which has a lot of cachet in the SQL Server space. It's a great tool. I have both of these installed. I use both of them pretty regularly. But we'll do Azure Data Studio today. If you do a Google search for Azure Data Studio, you'll find it. If you do a Bing search, you probably won't. We'll select Download Now, and it takes us to a page where we can download and install Azure Data Studio. For Windows, there's a user installer and a system installer. So I'm just going to install it for myself, the user installer. This does not require a UAC check. It installs everything within the user's local. The system installer will make it available for everybody and does require a UAC check. So let's do this installation, go through, select our location, and just a little bit of next to install it. Once it installs, we'll be able to use the tool. Azure Data Studio itself contains functionality to connect to SQL Server and do a lot of stuff, but it also includes a lot of extensions that you can work with. I'll probably have a video in the future talking about some extensions, but for the moment, we have our client tool right here, and I'll close a couple of toasts and then connect to a new SQL Server instance. So I say new connection, and I'm going to connect to my local machine. I could look up the name of it, but I can also use dot to connect to the local instance. So dot means the same thing essentially as localhost. And I'll trust the server connection. And now we have one brand new sparkling SQL Server installation on a virtual machine. So with that, let's go back to the man with the face. Over the course of this video, we downloaded and installed SQL Server 2022 Developer Edition on a Windows VM. There was a lot going on, but the journey is just beginning. But wait, you may be saying, how do you automate this installation? Good question, me pretending to be hypothetical you. Yes, you can automate installation, and frankly, you should automate this installation in real-world environments, especially if you care for more than 1 or 2 SQL Server installations. Drop a comment below and let me know if you'd like to see a video on automating SQL Server installation. If I get enough feedback on this, I'll create a video specifically on that topic. We'll have links and show notes in the description below. And until we see each other in the next video, take care.